Joe Biden has been announcing his cabinet picks and his emphasis on diversity. But is Biden the right person to mend racial divides? We'll talk about that and more with syndicated columnist Ruben Navarrette on today's edition of Jimmy at the Crossroads. I'm Jimmy Sengenberger, coming to you in partnership with the Washington Examiner, and we are starting right now.
Gonna talk money, gonna talk politics, great for all generations. Oh, what a great mix, I said. Gonna talk money, gonna talk politics, great for all generations. Oh, what a great mix. I got Jimmy at the crossroads, making sense out of nonsense. Come on, Jimmy, what you got?
Hello, my friends, and welcome back to another edition of Jimmy at the Crossroads. I'm Jimmy Sengenberger, coming to you in partnership with the Washington Examiner once again, and it is such a pleasure and a privilege to be with you. Thanks so much for joining us. I do appreciate it, especially as we're gearing up now for Christmas in just a few weeks, if you can believe it. I do also appreciate your support in sharing our content, so please, if you enjoy what we're offering on Jimmy at the Crossroads, please do like and share this video, and also be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel, youtube.com/Jimmy at the Crossroads. And of course, be sure to follow our friends at the Washington Examiner at washingtonexaminer.com. So folks, right now we are seeing Joe Biden, who is very likely to be the next president of the United States. It looks like the Trump campaign is exhausting all of its legal options, but we'll see what happens. Joe Biden keeps announcing new members of his cabinet, certainly those he would like to appoint. And he's put a real emphasis on the notion of diversity. And he's talking about how he wants to help heal racial divides amidst all the tensions that we're facing in America today. But to what extent is Joe Biden even the person to do that? And how about the emphasis on diversity, maybe over qualifications when it comes to selecting a presidential cabinet? Let's talk about this with someone who has focused a lot on writing about this issue. Ruben Navarrette is a syndicated columnist and host of Navarrette Nation, and he joins me now here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Ruben, welcome to the show, sir.
Good to be with you again, Jimmy. You know, I am just here for the bumper music, the best in the business. I always enjoy your startup.
Well, I appreciate it. And even better when it's yours truly on the harmonica, right?
Absolutely. No doubt. Yeah.
So, Ruben, I appreciate you joining us as always. I mean, you have been writing quite a bit about the dynamics in play in terms of what Joe Biden is looking at vis-a-vis his cabinet selection, also the racial issues that are going on in America. And let's just start with Joe Biden as a president-to-be who is emphasizing this idea of healing the nation, broadly speaking, and bringing back the soul of the nation, but also particularly on racial issues. What do you make of Biden as the hero in that respect?
Right. So, you know, anybody looking back on 2020 would see a couple of massive crisis, chaotic developments. One would be the pandemic, obviously. It makes sense that Joe Biden would say, I'm going to fix the pandemic. I'm going to cure the pandemic. I'm going to end it. And also, if you look back on the summer we had and race relations, you look at the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis in May, and the summer of rioting and protests, it makes sense that the president-elect would say, you know, I want to heal that too. I want to be the civil rights president. So it makes sense that he's saying that. What doesn't make sense in my mind is if you study anything about Joe Biden's, 40 or some years in the Senate, his nearly 50-year-long career in public service, he's the last person on earth who should be talking about civil rights and who should take on the agenda of being a civil rights healer, because he has throughout his career at various times played the race card to try to assure working class white Democrats that he could protect them from African Americans and other people of color on issues of crime and the like. This has been his argument. So again, it sounds to me like Joe Biden is offering to heal a crisis that he spent 40 years creating.
Now, of course, he had selected Kamala Harris as his vice presidential pick, and she will be the first black and woman to serve
Yeah.
as vice president of the United States. How about that aspect? Does that help his case at all?
Well, it's interesting. If you look back on the debate, it was he started his campaign in April of 2019. He became the nominee, the Democratic nominee, in April of 2020. So for 1 year, he campaigned for the nomination. And in June of 2019, now 3 months into his campaign hit the skids because he faced off against Kamala Harris in a debate, and she, tore him apart on this idea of race. Basically, accused him of being racist, at least racially insensitive, for his position on forced busing in the 70s and for palling around with these segregationists in the Senate. And he didn't quite have a good answer. So, yes, it's great, I think, that he chose her. But let's not forget that in choosing her, it helps accentuate the very divide that separated them from the beginning.
Well, not only did she make hay at the debate, but then I believe she sold T-shirts talking about how that little girl was me. She made money off
Yeah.
of her attack against the guy to whom she will now be partnered up as VP. But here's the thing:
Yeah.
I mean, you look at her criminal justice record over in California, and there are a heck of a lot of criminal justice reform advocates and people on the left who are like,
Yes.
"Wait a second,
On the left.
I'm not so sure that she's the kind of person that we should be having as VP."
This is on the left. You have to understand the criticism of Kamala Harris is coming from the left. It's coming from defense attorneys and others who say that Kamala Harris was the worst kind of prosecutor. She has a good record because she cheats. That's how prosecutors get convictions and get really good conviction rates. They cheat. And when they break the law, when they engage in prosecutorial misconduct, it is really up to her when she's the district attorney of San Francisco County or in San Francisco to oversee the process and say, yes, you're right. Some of the people working for me have been accused of this. Let's get to the bottom of it. And later, when she's attorney general in California and there are opportunities to overturn convictions based on faulty evidence, she fights those attempts to basically keep people in jail. So, yeah, there are a lot of people out there on the defense side and the defense bar on the left of the Democratic Party who think that Kamala Harris basically made her bones politically in California by coming forward, Jimmy, and saying, look, I'm an African American woman, and I'm a black woman. I'm gonna lock up a lot of black people, and in doing so, I'm gonna convince all you white liberals in San Francisco and elsewhere that you're safe. I'm gonna keep you safe. I'm gonna protect you, and in return, you're gonna vote me into the U.S. Senate, which is what happened.
So, what are the dynamics then, in your view, Ruben Navarrette, a syndicated columnist, our guest here on Jimmy at the Crossroads, within the Democratic Party and the issue of race and social justice and a criminal justice reform in particular, given the idea that you have Biden as president, Kamala Harris as vice president, and a nation that is still torn in this racial turmoil?
It's incredibly ironic that the Democratic ticket, and this is sort of arguing after the fact because they've been elected, but basically, the Democrats put forward in the year of George Floyd a ticket. At the top of the ticket is a white male who spent his entire career catering to Rust Belt whites, working class whites, to tell them he could protect them from African Americans. He authored the 1994 crime bill, which is singularly responsible for the epidemic in mass incarceration. That's the Biden bill. He called it the Biden bill for 20 years. He loved it. He was proud of it. So that's the guy at the top of the ticket. The number two person is the person who used the Biden bill to put a bunch of people in prison. So this is beyond bizarre, right? I mean, a lot of Democrats went into the election holding their nose to vote for this ticket because they really wanted to defeat Donald Trump, and they said this is worth the cost of it all. But I can't tell you the number of African American friends I have who know the score, who've been following the story, and say, I can't believe these are the two people we put up in 2020.
Well, and then isn't it ironic in a sense then that the Democrats, who are supposed to be the standard bearer for improving on criminal justice issues, now at least the current Democratic Party is supposedly the party that wants to advance criminal justice reform, you had President Donald Trump move forward in Congress and get through Congress and then sign himself the First Step Act and take some other criminal justice reform steps. Isn't it interesting that it was a Republican president who actually took those steps along the way a few decades after his opponent passed that crime bill?
It's exactly right. It is important to note that. It's one theory as to why that's floating around as to why Trump did so well with African Americans.
Yes.
Typically you can always count on the Democratic candidate for president getting 92, 93% of the black vote. In this case, Joe Biden got less than that. He gave up about 20% of the African American vote by some estimates. And some of it had to do with that, a general sense that African Americans saw Joe Biden as phony, as someone who believed one thing once and now believes something else, and you're never quite sure where he's at and what he's going to promise you next. But Jimmy, your head and my head, those spun around once before, because when Donald Trump came forward and said, "I'm a Republican and I support tariffs," I had to check the script to make sure I was hearing that correctly, right? So
yes.
we crossed into the twilight zone where you can be a Republican who's pro-union. Let me get this straight. Pro-union, he engages in class warfare all the time, talks about the elites as a Republican, and he supports tariffs, which is a form of protectionism. Not my kind of Republican. So, we definitely, both parties play this game.
Well, I don't want to relitigate the Trump administration, especially in this particular conversation. I would say that there are a lot of things where he was my kind of Republican, a lot of things where he hasn't been my kind of Republican. One of those areas is definitely the topic of tariffs, because as you know, I'm about as free trade a guy as you will find anywhere, Ruben.
Right. Yeah. And I think politics get complicated, Jimmy, when, for instance, in the 90s, people forget. In 1988, way back when, Michael Dukakis, the presidential nominee in 1988 for the Democratic Party, was perceived as weak on crime, okay? As a card-carrying member of the ACLU, he flubbed a question in one of the debates about what would happen if your wife was attacked and killed, and he came off as weak on crime. So here comes Bill Clinton, and Clinton is sharp. So in 1992, he says, "Tell you what, vote for me. I'm for the death penalty. I will execute people. I have executed people, and I'll execute them again." And that was the model. So in the 1990s, Jimmy, we got a close-up look at this anti-crime Democrat. And Joe Biden was one of those, and Joe Lieberman was one of those, and Bill Clinton and Al Gore, this is who these people were. And the problem is, Jimmy, when you stay in the game as long as Joe Biden does, right? Most people are supposed to be retired playing golf, writing books by now. He stayed in the game for 50 years. So the pendulum all the way around. And all of a sudden, you end up in the George Floyd era, and here's Joe Biden.
Well, you made another interesting observation, which is about how President Trump did better than the average Republican when it comes to the Black community and also the Latino community. I mean, when you look at those numbers in a lot of these states, it's pretty remarkable that it was suburban whites that seemed to move away more from President Trump, and it was the minority communities that are generally thought of as Democratic that went to President Trump, despite years of the left blasting him for racism and constantly ad nauseum on CNN and MSNBC. You just saw that drumbeat over and over again.
Yeah, the percentage for Latinos was bigger than 20% for African Americans. The Latino figure I saw a dozen exit polls that put it between 33% and 36%. Those are not George W. Bush type numbers. He was at 44% of the Hispanic vote in his reelection. Ronald Reagan, was at got 40% of the Hispanic vote in his reelection in 1984. But still, coming in third place is Donald Trump at about 33 to 36%. What I think is interesting to note here, Jimmy, is that conservatives, they're in a tough spot, rock and hard place, because on the one hand, I hear a lot of white men Republicans telling me this whole race thing makes me nervous. I don't really like the whole idea that race is factored in when you're choosing cabinet positions, and how many African Americans, how many Latinos. Why can't we all just be Americans and let's not talk about race? Perfectly legitimate. But at the same time, you have this great story. Trump gets 20% of the Black vote, 36% of the Latino vote. And then the same conservatives flip the script and all of a sudden say, "But let me talk to you about this," right? So I'm trying to process it. And here's what I figured out, that there are people out there who don't want to talk about race when it makes them look bad. They will talk about race when it makes them look good.
I think there's also something that's going on when it comes to identity politics versus talking about people's identities, where Republicans tend to talk more about, okay, we do have these certain communities that you don't think of as being traditionally Republican. Say the Black community, we got more Black people who are supporting Republicans. The Latino community, more Latinos that are supporting Republicans. They have that kind of, let's talk about how those groups are now coming over to Republicans, whereas the Democrats really play into that idea of, let's not just talk about the number of people that we have in these communities, but let's play up these particular issues for those communities in an identity politics way. I think the strategies are different in how Republicans and Democrats approach that issue of race.
I think that for instance, if you look at race or gender, it's a minor difference, because the media created, for instance, this unfair narrative that Republicans were waging a war on women, as you recall.
Oh, yes.
This was language from 2012, right? So now at that point, you want to say, well, this is ridiculous that you're dividing up the electorate into men and women. There is no war on women, and Republicans are not waging a war on women. Great. But the story today in the 2020 election is that more Republican women were elected than ever before, right? And so I think that conservatives and Republicans leave money on the table and miss an opportunity to talk about what they're doing right. They should be playing up the fact that they're doing better with women, with African Americans, and with Latinos. Don't be afraid of those things. Don't be afraid of, quote, identity politics, okay? Ronald Reagan, famously said, and I've shared this with you before, he was told, I'm going to get you the Hispanic vote. And he says, you don't have to convince Hispanics to vote Republican. Hispanics are already Republican, Reagan said. They just don't know it.
Mm-hmm. Well,
so if you're smart,
yeah.
if you're Reagan or you're Bush, you embrace it. You don't run away from it.
To me, that goes down to the idea of messaging and how you're articulating your vision and not leaving different groups on the table in the sense that, for example, in 2012, I remember talking with, I forget who it is, but a Hispanic leader in Colorado on the conservative side, on the Republican side. And he was telling me that in 2012, the Romney campaign was just not interested in reaching out to Hispanics and doing that kind of outreach that then in 2016, President Trump's campaign said, absolutely, we're going to do this. And then again in 2020. And all it really was, more than anything, was saying, we are actually going to acknowledge that you exist. And we're not going to throw up our hands and say, nope, you're part of the Democrats. We're not even going to try for you. We're only going to do the base play. Now, President Trump has very much been a base-oriented president, but not in all respects, and certainly not during the campaign seasons.
I would say that Trump in 2016 was much more down the road, catering to white folks, saying, I'm going to build a wall. The Mexicans who come here are rapists and criminals. However, in 2020, it is clear he ran away from that, Jimmy. He ran away. You can't find that kind of rhetoric in the campaign in 2020. Instead, and he didn't even want to talk about immigration. Instead, he did what you said. He went out to Phoenix and to other cities that had big Hispanic populations, and he specifically asked for that vote. It's not complicated. Politicians make it much more complicated. You want my vote? Ask for it. Okay? And a lot of Republicans, as you said, Mitt Romney in 2012, they made the mistake of not asking for it. Mm-hmm. But with George W. Bush, famously, he was sitting in a meeting. Somebody came to him and said, he says, how much money do you need for Hispanic outreach? He said, I need $1 million. He turned to Karl Rove and said, give him $2 million. Okay? So do you want to play the game or not? If you want to play the game, you got to get in. You got to go to what Trump did. Go to the big Hispanic sign, Hispanics for Trump. You don't come up here and say, well, my friends at the Heritage Foundation are offended whenever we use the word Hispanic. That's identity politics. Take that banner down. Okay? I mean, help me help you, guys.
So you mentioned Biden's cabinet selections in terms of this diversity emphasis. And yes, a lot of conservatives, I know you and I talked on the radio a couple weeks ago about Ben Shapiro, for example, was saying, why is there this emphasis on diversity? All I care about is qualifications. And there is that sense among conservatives that qualifications should be the primary focus. Certainly that's my view. But you have a beef with that sort of idea.
I really do.
What is that?
Yeah, I really do. It goes back to when I was 18 years old, more than 35 years ago, I guess, when I was a high school senior with perfect grades applying to Harvard. And a lot of my classmates saying that, I wouldn't get in except for the fact that I'm Mexican because of affirmative action. And at that moment, I realized that you could be both qualified and diverse. You could have diversity and qualifications. And so I was shocked some 35 years later when Ben Shapiro is making the argument that somehow you have to choose between the two. And I said, this is crazy because I just went through a confirmation hearing, say, for Amy Coney Barrett, who, is a woman, was chosen because she was a woman to replace Ruth Bader Ginsburg, another woman. But man, she was qualified and on the merits and did a fantastic job. She was unflappable and smart and did the whole thing without notes. So I think what people have to do, they have to cross in their mind to this idea that somehow you can have your cake and eat it too. You can appoint the first Black Secretary of State, Colin Powell, and not miss a stitch, not lower your qualifications one bit, okay? He was as qualified to have that job as Warren Christopher or anybody who came before him, any other white male. And that's what ticks me off, Jimmy. Somehow you have all these mediocre white men who get these positions. We don't say boo about it, but if you put up a woman or a person of color, all of a sudden it's like, oh, it's diversity. Oh, we can't have diversity. We have to get the most qualified person. No, you can have both. You can have diversity and qualified.
But what about that point in time? Like, for example, Attorney General of California, Xavier Becerra, being tapped to become Health and Human Services Secretary, despite, and I saw you were critical of this selection. Also, the Wall Street Journal was blasting him for being woefully unqualified, and that it is clearly an identity politics play alone. And ideological too.
Well, yeah, but I feel bad because it feels like if it's an identity politics play, it's a really weak play. If you really, there are 4 cabinet positions that matter. Everybody knows this: state, defense, treasury, and AG. That's the way it is, okay? And for many, many years, it was white men had those positions. It was a big deal to put a woman in. The headline is still a big deal to put Janet Yellen in at Treasury. We've never had a woman heading the Treasury Department, right? It's 2020, right? Oh, this is a huge thing. We're bringing a woman in to head the Treasury Department. So white men have had the run of the game for the longest time, and nobody thought anything of it. But what I think is if you give Javier Becerra Health and Human Services, that's really a lower level position. Even with COVID, even with the pandemic, he's going to be part of a team of 8. They're attacking the pandemic. I think that's nickels and dimes. So if it's an identity play, as the Wall Street Journal would say, it's an awfully weak play.
Because of the position?
He should have been given Attorney General. Look, he's the California Attorney General. He's a Stanford grad, undergrad, and law school. He spent 20 years in the Cal legislature and almost 30 years in Congress, right? Now he's the Attorney General in California, which was the same position that Kamala Harris had as a launching point. I think he could have pulled off Attorney General of the United States. I'm just saying.
Thank you, by the way. You reminded me it's pronounced Javier, not Xavier, like Charles Xavier, for example, from X-Men. But with Javier Becerra.
I think Latinos need to be here's the headline is they need to be at the grown-up table, Jimmy.
Right. Well, but isn't that then an example of where a diversity-focused play can go awry when you put the person in the place to which they are not most qualified, and that you're simply looking for a person to fill that slot, which I think goes more to the point of like a Ben Shapiro, is that if you're emphasizing the diversity idea more, you may make that wrong selection.
And where I have a beef with Shapiro and people like him is they only see out of one eye. They don't see the whole picture. The same argument he's making now about an identity play and it being this person isn't qualified. Why take a lawyer and make him head of Health and Human Services? I agree. Where were you, Ben Shapiro, 4 years ago when Ben Carson, a surgeon, a doctor, was given HUD to run? Okay, a $47 billion a year apparatus at HUD, didn't know anything about public housing or urban development. So all of a sudden now, Ben's woke up. Hey, Ben, I hope you enjoyed your siesta. He's up now because Ben all of a sudden now has discovered, along with other white conservatives, oh my God, how is it possible that we put a lawyer where the doctor should be? Yeah, because you put a doctor where the HUD guy should be.
Well, I do have to say
about
that
what you said, boo.
I scratched my head at the time at that particular pick, although I do think that...
That's a nice way of putting it. You're much more diplomatic than me. You scratched your head.
Well, because I thought he would have been a good HHS selection. I think that
a Surgeon General, he would have been perfect.
Actually, absolutely. But I think that in terms of HUD, I mean, that is a position that I don't think is quite as dramatic as HHS in terms of making that appointment. But I also think that he has certain life experiences that can lend themselves, can be lent to that particular position.
Yeah, and it did not turn out that way.
Fair enough. But
we have the report card after 4 years. It didn't turn out that way.
So
I remember when Walter Mondale, 1984, chose Geraldine Ferraro as his running mate. A reporter asked Reagan, tried to put him on the spot because the reporters didn't like Reagan. The reporter asked Reagan, do you think this is a big deal that Walter Mondale has chosen the first woman running mate in U.S. history? And Reagan's smart. Reagan turns around and says, yeah, it's a really big deal. You know, it's like putting Sandra Day O'Connor on the Supreme Court. Okay?
Yeah. Game, set, match.
So here's the thing. Here's my point again. What Reagan understood at that moment is do not be afraid. Do not take the banner down. Don't be, identity politics. I can't identity politics. No, if you did it, brag about it, and then check and mate.
So, however, at the same time, I mean, what is that line? How do you make that determination as to whether that person is actually being picked specifically because it's a diversity play or because you're looking at the qualifications and the policy perspectives, and then also, okay, I like the fact that this person may make history in terms of being in this position?
Yeah, I always feel put off by the question because, I as I said to you before, in 30 years in media and working for companies like CNN and working for the Washington Post, The most mediocre people I see in my business are white men, other white men. Okay. I don't think you're Condoleezza Rice by accident. You're Dr. Condoleezza Rice because you worked your tail off and you really had to overcome a lot of obstacles. And so I don't think you miss a stitch when you make her national security advisor or secretary of state. But as I said in my column, the one you're referring to, if Condoleezza Rice had been born a white male, she'd have still made it to the Oval Office, but she would have been sitting behind the Resolute desk. Okay. She'd have been president. And most white men are born on third base. They don't have to even answer this question. The question that we're talking about, you and me, about qualifications. I'm all set to have that conversation. We'll start with all the boss's kids, every
See,
company
I think
in
there
America.
are,
The boss's kids
no,
got the internship,
yeah.
and a lot of them are white men who didn't deserve it.
So
Let's call
I
that
think
out.
I think there are two different aspects to this. There are some white men who absolutely have been born on third base, so to speak. That is to say that maybe they are the person who's the son of the boss, or the son of the president, or
I can
or
think of
daughter
two
of
of
the
them:
president.
Hunter
Maybe.
Biden,
Sure.
Hunter Biden.
Hmm.
Okay, you. Hunter Biden has not had to work as hard in his life as you
Yes.
have,
Yeah.
or I have. Okay, that's truly being born on third base.
That's a fact. Absolutely.
Okay, and Don Jr., third base. They're there
Fair.
on third base. Okay,
Sure. But there are a lot of white men, and I know it, who have worked their tail off, I would say not born on third base, and have to work hard in order to be able to get those sorts of achievements because they didn't actually have that boss father of theirs or somebody to just say, hey, I'm going to give you $1 million to get you going with your new company or something like that.
and that is true. That's a legitimate fact. You're right about that. But there are benefits that go to that white male, even if they are struggling. Which is, I haven't ever heard of a white male working class kid, son of a fireman, who got into Yale, and his classmates all said he got in because of his race. That has never happened. Nobody said you got in because you're a white kid. But the black kid and the Latino kid get in, and all of a sudden it's you got in because of your race. There are things, let's put it this way. There are things that you and I as men don't have to deal with, okay? That our sisters and mothers and cousins have to deal with. And just because we don't have to deal with them, it means we don't have to think about those things. But every once in a while, Jimmy, whether it's the Me Too movement or whatever, there's this reminder to me that I've got it made, okay? That as a man, I was born on third base. And there are things I don't have to worry about that my two daughters will have to worry about.
In other words, there are certain aspects of life on which you're born on third base depending upon your circumstances. And there are other aspects of life where you may have to work very hard. Absolutely.
It could be something crass like race or gender.
Mm-hmm. And there are different fields of work that actually can advantage women. And there are a lot of fields that can certainly advantage men. And you find, like engineering, for example, you can find yourself, if you're a woman, this is why there's such an emphasis on getting more young women in the STEM fields, is because you don't have as many. There are a variety of reasons for that. But then if you are a young woman who's getting into an engineering field, you can face a lot more hurdles or different types of treatment than men do. And so I certainly agree that there's a point there. Even in the
household, look, it even happens in the household. One of the big stories from COVID, and you can Google it, was done tons of times, was the amount of women who've had to leave the workforce because they're working from home and they have to work from home while balancing childcare and keeping the household going. I wrote a column about this, and you hear from lots of women who say, my husband tries really hard. He washes dishes, he cooks meals. But at the end of the day, the woman still does more. I'm sorry, it's a fact, okay? But I wrote a column where I listed everything I did, and my wife still had more things, right?
Sure.
Take the dog to the vet, all these other things. So.
Let's broaden this again. We're talking with syndicated columnist Ruben Navarrette here on Jimmy at the Crossroads, diving into the topics of race and politics on the program. And one thing as we start to wrap up here with you, Ruben, one thing that's so striking to me is this idea of where we are in terms of the cultural moment and the social moment here in the United States of America as we're looking at the likely changing of the guard of the presidency. But you also see that in the House of Representatives, the number of Republicans has increased noticeably. In the United States Senate, we'll see where it goes, certainly with Georgia come January 5th. But we are seeing the very likely scenario where Republicans do maintain control of the United States Senate. Republicans did not lose a single state legislature in this election cycle. And so there are a lot of different political dynamics that can bleed into the racial issues. And I wonder where you think things may head, especially with Biden's cabinet selection, race and gender, and the cultural moment that we're facing right now. with the
I like to
political
see.
makeup in Congress?
I was happy with the elections turnout as you laid it out, because I think it's important that if the Democrats have a big win in the White House, that they really get spanked in the congressional races, which is what happened. There's no positive spin for Nancy Pelosi and the Democratic leadership in the House, and the fact that they didn't pick up seats, that they lost seats, that they expected. They don't understand in their mind why it was they were able to take back the White House, but not fortify their lead in the House of Representatives. And so I like that. I like divided government. I like the fact that one party won on one score and one party won the other score. But if you're a Democrat and you're smart, I think you start realizing you can't take African Americans and Latinos for granted to the race issue. And that if you neglect them and you don't have a ground game and you simply think, oh, we're going to spend all our time going after the suburbs and white women who live in the suburbs, you're going to find that someone like Trump comes along and carves out a lot of the minority vote. But if you're a Republican, I think it's a smart play right now to accentuate what it is about your party that minorities are drawn to, people of color are drawn to. So they already have some, double down and increase that share.
Yeah, I think there's something that is very important to think about here, consider, and that is the fact that you had split ticket voting across the country, where while there were a lot of people who voted for Joe Biden, they voted for a Republican in the United States Senate or the United States House of Representatives, or to keep a Republican control of a state legislature. And that's not an insignificant thing. That shows that voters are looking at the candidate as well as the party. And that also gives a roadmap for Republicans moving forward.
I think that will be shown up again in the Senate races in Georgia. I think that the way we typically vote as Americans is we just put a Democrat in the White House. The next time we get to vote, we're going to put 2 Republicans back in the Senate. And they like it that way.
Speaking of Georgia, how do you see that panning out? I mean, you did have Sidney Powell and Lynwood, 2 attorneys that are no longer involved with the Trump campaign, but are pursuing legal issues in Georgia and other states, although the courts have been dismissing their cases. Just on Monday, we had the Georgia case, for example, get dismissed in court. But we don't need to get into legal arguments. But one thing that Lynwood in particular was shouting about at a rally with at least hundreds of Trump supporters there was saying you shouldn't vote in the Georgia Senate races. Then you saw a pushback from Dan Crenshaw, Corey Lewandowski, people on Newsmax, all sorts of Republicans saying, wait a second, don't do that. This is crazy. And Republican President Donald Trump himself goes over the weekend and campaigns for Loeffler and Perdue and says, you guys got to get out and vote. Do you think that there could be much of an influence from the negativity and the concerns about the election outcomes in November that could derail Republican chances in the Senate come January?
It's a real thing. It's a real thing. It's the ball's in the air, because I'm of the opinion that you need to vote, and it's shame on Lynwood for telling people not to vote. And I'm glad the Republicans are countering it, saying you need to go out and vote. And no sooner had Lynwood made that comment that people were looking into his own record and finding out how many Democrats he supported. There's a theory that goes around that he's actually working for the Democratic Party because he's telling Republicans to stay home. Just because he wears a white MAGA cap doesn't mean that he's on the Republican side. He sounds like a Democrat. He's telling people to stay home.
What makes me scratch my head in this moment is that Crenshaw, when he pointed that out, Dan Crenshaw, congressman from Texas, he pointed out Lynwood's past givings to Democrats and all that. Like, I think millions of dollars, like at least a lot of money has been given to Democrats in the past. He was absolutely lambasted by some on the right, including Michelle Malkin, for example.
Well, I don't think my friend Michelle Malkin should have lambasted him for that. I think that's a very legitimate point. And the practical consequence of Lynwood telling people not to vote on the Republican side is basically saying, get used to the phrase Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, which I don't welcome.
You have to. You have to get out and vote if you're a Republican in Georgia, because in those U.S. Senate races, you should not lose. Like, really, Republicans shouldn't have lost Georgia for the presidency, but you really shouldn't lose these 2 United States Senate races. I think the odds are still in Republicans' favor that Loeffler and Perdue will still be elected, but you never know, especially with these kinds of concerns. There are a lot of people who are deeply, and to some extent, there's some legitimacy in terms of concerns about election issues, but there are other areas where I'm just like, no, that's not where you should be looking at.
Democrats were already on fire on election day. They showed up in droves and they voted for Joe Biden. That's the end of it. The people who are on fire now are the Republicans, the people who feel that somehow they've got to vote for these Republicans or put them back in Washington. But getting back to the original point, though, it is tricky. The reason it's tricky is, how do you tell people, again, the double message that the election was stolen? You cannot trust elections, and so we want you to come out and vote in this next election.
Right. And I think that gets to my deeper concern, which is that there is so much fear or concern or frustration or animosity toward how the election outcome came about and all those different things that it is turning people off, especially this kind of rhetoric. But let me ask you one final question, Ruben, and that is,
Sure.
Let's presume for a moment that Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue do get elected. You have Republican control of the Senate. You have Democrat control of the United States House by only several votes. And you have Democratic President Joe Biden with VP Kamala Harris. How does that play out from a political dynamic vis-a-vis some of the gridlock issues?
You mean so divided Congress?
Yes, divided
Republicans
government.
keep control of the Senate.
Yes.
Well, this won't be unique.
With a small
I'm not the first
majority for both Republicans in the Senate and Democrats in the House.
I'm not the first person to say this. You're going to see a split between Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden. It's played out before. They are in different. They have different agendas. Joe Biden's going to go to the middle, be much more moderate. Pelosi will try to pull him left at some places, and there'll be friction. You'll see daylight between the two. Also, you'll see a willingness on Biden's part to really deal with McConnell, to really go back into a Senate mold as a former senator and say, let's work a deal, which is going to cause the AOC wing of the Democratic Party to inflame and say, oh my God, we helped elect you, and now you're cozying up to the enemy. And the last dynamic is anytime Joe Biden doesn't want to deliver something like on immigration reform, when he doesn't want to deliver immigration reform because it's too complicated and it ticks off African Americans and working class whites, the only two people in America he cares about, apparently, the only two groups he cares about, he can blame Mitch McConnell. He's going to blame Mitch McConnell and the Republic. Oh, I really tried. I really wanted to. I really was going, oh, but then they took it from me. So he's going to be thanking his lucky stars that Chuck Schumer is not running the Senate, because if Democrats ran everything, he wouldn't have a bad guy. He wouldn't have a foil. That's
interesting. You know, you look at President Trump, he certainly has used Nancy Pelosi as a foil, and Pelosi's used him as a foil. I mean, those guys, the two of them have not talked in almost 2 years now, I think. I mean, which is absolutely remarkable, the idea that the Speaker of the House and the President of the United States have not talked in something of like 2 years.
They have a great
other
relationship.
Than quick pleasantchoies. Yeah, a great relationship.
They have a mutually beneficial relationship.
Yeah. I see what you mean.
It wasn't that long ago that Donald Trump was writing checks to Nancy Pelosi for her reelection campaigns when he was a private citizen and a Manhattan Democrat, by the way.
Well,
okay.
But what's interesting to me is what you said in terms of the possible friction between a President Biden and a Speaker Pelosi, which is very different from the alignment that we saw with President Trump and Mitch McConnell, especially when it comes to the confirmation process of judicial nominees, but also a whole slew of other issues. They really were hell-bent on working together as often as possible, and you didn't see the kind of friction between them that a lot of people predicted would happen after President Trump took office.
No, that's absolutely true. And I think more times than not, when you have a new president, you have that friction. You had it between Harry Reid in the Senate and Barack Obama, the president. At some point in time, you understand how federalism works, and you realize and how the division of power works. You have the executive branch has one set of agenda items, and the legislative branch has another set. And so because the Nancy Pelosi's members have to run for re-election every 2 years, they're very skittish, Jimmy, about passing things that are going to be unpopular, okay, no matter what the issue is. And so at some point, you're going to see, again, lots of daylight between Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden, and you'll probably see an interesting dynamic whereby Biden blames everything that goes wrong on Mitch McConnell.
It will be fascinating to see if indeed Joe Biden becomes president of the United States. Ruben Navarrette, syndicated columnist, always great to check in with you, my friend. Fascinating insights. Thanks for joining us once again here on Jimmy at the Crossroads.
Thanks, Jimmy.
And Merry Christmas, by the way.
Yeah, you too. Merry Christmas.
Once again, syndicated columnist Ruben Navarrette joining us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Look, folks, I'm being realistic here. When you look at the way in which the electoral outcomes have come to pass, the certification in the states across the country, and also how the legal proceedings have gone in terms of Trump campaign challenges and other challenges to the election outcomes in these various states, we haven't seen any indications. In fact, the cases that have been brought forward by the Trump campaign and actually have gone to court, I think only one of them has been successful. So while I do think that any legal avenues that still exist for the Trump campaign to make challenges are reasonable and worthwhile to pursue, I don't see how there is an outcome in which any of these state legislatures overturn the outcomes, especially I think all the states have certified now. I think California this week was the very last state to go ahead and do certification of the presidential results. I don't see the Electoral College having any faithless electors, or certainly not enough to turn around the outcome to President Trump so that he could win re-election, or in the United States Congress come January 6th. It's hard to think that you actually will see members of Congress, more than a few, contest the outcome and say, okay, let's stop Joe Biden from being sworn in as president, from certifying it in the Congress. I don't see that outcome. Again, pursue any sort of legal avenues, and absolutely, there needs to be more investigation into voter fraud concerns and other election integrity issues. That's why I've been speaking since, April on this program, if not sooner, about the need to make sure that vote-by-mail systems are structured right, that you set them up properly. We've done multiple shows talking about what's worked, for example, here in Colorado, and compared that to other states, or said Colorado is a model in these ways. If you're going to vote by mail, do it like Colorado did and does. And a heck of a lot of states didn't, and they rushed it, and they put systems and structures in place that lacked the appropriate safeguards and lacked the necessary controls to catch some of the issues that might come up. Without question, I co-authored with former Colorado Deputy Secretary of State Suzanne Taheri 2 op-eds, one for the Washington Examiner and one for the Federalist, in which we laid out some legitimate areas of concern, both in terms of the current election cycle and what to look for 2020, but also what to get right moving forward in 2022. That's why, regardless of what the Trump campaign is doing and how any of these lawsuits come about and how they end, how they wrap up, we need to continue to look underneath the hood of election systems in state after state after state after state, because there are serious, real issues. I do think that signature verification issues in Pennsylvania and Georgia are real, especially because in Pennsylvania, they threw out the signature verification requirements for mail ballots. And in Georgia, there is reason to do an audit, just at the very least, to better understand how to improve the system and what might have gone wrong, make sure that the numbers are accurate, do an audit of the signature verifications system and the signatures on the ballot envelopes. Do that. I supported that. We endorsed that in the Federalist piece that Suzanne Taheri and I published. But at the same time, we also have to be realistic when we look at the prospects for overturning the outcome now in state after state after state of the 2020 elections. As I said before, I'm an advocate of President Trump and his campaign continuing to pursue legal avenues to make sure that every legal vote is counted, that you get underneath the hood and figure out, okay, what's wrong with these systems, that you catch errors, so on and so forth. But realistically, I don't see that path. How President Trump gets another term unless it's in 2024. And we'll see if he decides to run in 2024. So again, they're going to continue to pursue legal avenues, but there isn't really a path that I can see now. So that's why we need to have these realistic discussions about what now with the Biden presidency. And we have to make sure that voters in Georgia, without a doubt, without question, Republican voters in Georgia get out and participate, and that they don't say, wait a second, I'm not going to because I'm worried about Dominion voting systems or other concerns. Okay, there's some legitimacy to some of these worries, without a doubt, in some of these systems, including Georgia, and how they've set up their elections. Fair enough. But that doesn't mean that you stay home and don't participate, and you give up any opportunity, any chance of success. If you stay home and you add up the numbers of people who are Republicans staying home because of voter fraud concerns, or election integrity concerns, then you're basically forfeiting to the Democrats. And saying, oh, the system is corrupt isn't going to make up for your inaction, your failure not to vote. So Georgia voters absolutely need to get out and participate. Republicans cannot stay at home, so to speak. They have to participate. And we have to have realistic discussions about what's next come January 20th, 2021. Because conservatives need to be prepared. This is what's happening, or this is what's coming about. So get ready to fight in these ways, to push back in those ways. It's one thing to push for your principles. It's one thing to push for things like election integrity and to make sure that we leave no stone unturned in any areas where there are legitimate questions. For sure. For sure. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that you can't realistically say, okay, we're going to look ahead at the future, and this is what's going to happen, most likely. So how can we prepare? And also make sure to participate in the election process. Because otherwise, if you're a Republican, you increase the likelihood of a Democrat-controlled Senate. And if that happens, a Democrat-controlled Senate, then that check on Biden is lost. And Schumer, Pelosi, Biden, and Harris will have full reign over what happens in this country in a variety of areas, not just a limited number of areas. Especially, too, when it comes to the courts. Then Republicans don't really have to negotiate all that much with Democrats. And Democrats don't have to negotiate that much with Republicans. Republicans lose the seat at the table. So it's absolutely critical, of course, from a conservative standpoint, that Republicans hold on to the United States Senate and not lose any ground there. Here on Jimmy at the Crossroads, we will always focus on what's realistic in terms of what's going to happen, things that will come down the pike. And also, we're going to be a principled program, as we always have been, that says, here are the core tenets of what we should believe, how we should look at issues of the day, and what lenses we should examine the fights going on in the country right now. That's what we're going to be talking about moving forward into 2021 when we produce a heck of a lot more content here on Jimmy at the Crossroads with the best guests and top-notch conversations. That is it for us today here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. We're expecting to be joined tomorrow by Florida Congresswoman-elect Kat Kemick in our ongoing series. We're going to be doing our second episode on this of conversations, interviews with millennial Republicans just elected to the United States House of Representatives. Republican Kat Kemick is a millennial. She was just elected in the 3rd Congressional District in Florida, and I'm looking forward to having her on the program to talk about where millennials are at right now, where she wants to help take the House of Representatives, the political dynamics. We'll see what we talk about with Representative-elect Kemick, and I hope you'll be along for the ride. Thanks so much for joining us today here again on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Special thanks to Ruben Navarrette, Syndicated columnist, our guest on the show, to the Washington Examiner, our friends and partners on this program, and of course, to you for liking, subscribing, sharing our content. We appreciate it. Thank you. And by the way, if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to the YouTube channel, youtube.com/Jimmy at the Crossroads. And also, we're catching up still the podcast, but on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and tune in. We've got the Jimmy at the Crossroads podcast. Please, whichever is your favorite podcast platform, go ahead and subscribe today. Hope you have a great rest of your day. We will be back tomorrow with Representative-elect Kat Kemick. In the meantime, have a great one. And as always, may God bless America.